Welcome to Upper House, an initiative of the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation. Located in the heart of UW-Madison, we gather, inquire, worship, and learn. We engage around the arts and humanities, science, society, justice, vocation, and theology. We explore the life of the mind and the questions of the soul, and seek to engage our world more faithfully and wisely. We're glad you're here. Welcome. I'm Dan Hummel, the Director for University Engagement at Upper House. Upper House is a center for Christian study located on the campus of UW-Madison. Our passion is to foster intellectual and spiritual formation in our university community and to call Christians to the important integrative work in their vocational pursuits. That integrative work doesn't just include connecting our religious commitments to our careers and callings. It also includes engagement with our community and our national civic life. In a word, politics. Politics is the way groups of people make decisions. The polis was the ancient Greek city-state, and so politics in the ancient context concerned decision-making processes and the issues of common concern in the classical world. Today, we're far away from the situation of ancient Greece, but yet our language reflects this history. Politics, at its best, is deeply tied to the Christian understanding of the gospel as good news for all people in every aspect of life, and the belief that Jesus inaugurated a new creation with his resurrection and is king over all powers in this world. Politics, again at its best, should not be confused with partisanship. In recent years, there's perhaps no more contested area of public life than partisan politics, defined by tribal loyalty, polarization, and the attainment of power. The sociologist Liliana Mason has described partisanship as not just another social identity alongside race, religion, class, and the normal, but a mega identity that can reliably predict all other social identities. So how are Christians who identify so deeply with the symbol of sacrifice, the cross, to understand their political responsibilities in this time and in this place, in the United States in 2021? Today, I'm joined by Daniel K. Williams, a scholar and professor of history, whose new book is titled The Politics of the Cross. The subtitle of Dan's book is what originally piqued my interest, a Christian alternative to partisanship. Here at Upper House, and I'm sure for many of you watching, the specter of partisanship has been a constant in recent years, and only grown as we've been unable to gather in person. Dan's book comes at an ideal time, and I'm excited to introduce him to you in just a couple minutes. But before bringing Dan on screen, a few points about our time together. Today's time will be divided roughly into three sections. First, Dan will give us about 30 minutes of remarks, which he's titled, Does God Have a Political Party? The topics Dan will discuss in those 30 minutes cover the first few chapters in the Politics of the Cross book as well. After Dan's remarks, he and I will discuss some aspects of his new book and some of his guidance for how Christians should engage political issues. A key point here, and one I'll reiterate again later, what we will not be doing is prescribing Christians how they should vote on a partisan basis. To borrow a quote from Dan's book, what matters is not primarily how we vote, but why we vote. He says, if our votes are shaped by a biblically guided and politically informed love of our neighbor, we will be doing the work of the kingdom, regardless of which party we might support in any given election. This thinking will guide our time today as well. And so that conversation between Dan and me will lead us into the final part of our event. We'll have a period of Q&A with audience questions. There was space to ask questions on the registration form, so I have a good list of pre-submitted questions. But you can also weigh in and ask questions using the chat function on your screen. And so one brief digression before we get to Dan. For those of you who registered, there was a question on the form asking how you identify politically. The options were conservative, moderate, liberal, other, or no answer. I wanted to just briefly share the results of that very unscientific poll here. As you can see, at least by registrations, we have a very politically diverse bunch, with a plurality selecting moderate. Thanks to everyone who participated. Just naming the diversity here will hopefully help situate each of us, since we're all tuning in virtually, as we think about these issues today. So now to introduce to you Daniel K. Williams. Daniel earned his PhD in history at Brown University and is professor of history at the University of West Georgia. He's the author of 4 books on American history, including God's Own Party, The Making of the Christian Right, a book, I might add, that's widely regarded as the standard history on the topic, and one I read as part of my exams list for a PhD in history here at UW just a few years ago. His other works of history include Defenders of the Unborn, the pro-life movement before Roe v. Wade, and the election of the evangelical, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and the presidential contest of 1976. Dan has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Christianity Today, and he blogs regularly at The Anxious Bench with Patheos. Welcome, Dan.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was a very kind introduction, and thank you especially for inviting me to talk at this forum. I'm really looking forward to this event. I'm especially looking forward to the Q&A, to the dialogue that we'll have together. I think this is a vitally important topic. The strong audience response that you've received from people across the political spectrum, I think, is a testament to how relevant the issue of Christian thinking about politics is today. When I titled this talk, Does God Have a Political Party?, I was mindful, of course, that the obvious answer is no. And I think you'll be reassured that that is ultimately the answer that I'm going to come to. But even though that may seem obvious at some level, it seems to me that a majority of Americans today consider partisan voting a moral act. In some way, God is identified in their minds with a particular political stance. And to give some examples of this, if we take a few recent studies from 2016 or 2018, some of the most recent data I was able to get, according to one poll in 2018, 61% of Democrats view Republicans as, quote, racist, sexist, or bigoted. In turn, 49% of Republicans, according to that same poll, viewed Democrats as, quote, ignorant. Almost an equal percentage viewed them as arrogant. And perhaps most strikingly, Americans are now less likely to marry across partisan lines than across religious lines. So it's more likely, for example, that a Democratic Christian would marry a Democratic Jew than that a Democratic Christian would marry a Republican Christian, or to, I guess, put other religious terms in, we could talk about marrying across religious lines as marrying a marriage between a secular person, an atheist and a Christian, or something of that nature. We're essentially looking at a world in which our partisan identity has become our primary moral identity. And perhaps it's not surprising, therefore, that 41% of Democrats said in 2018 that they would be, quote, extremely or somewhat disappointed if a close family member married a Republican. So where does this leave the church? That was the question that drove my interest in writing The Politics of the Cross. As Dan noted, I had studied American religion and politics for some time. My first book on the subject, God's Own Party, came out in 2010. And after that, I wrote a book on abortion politics. I wrote a book on the 1976 presidential election as well, which very much featured religion as one important variable. And after writing all of this material, it occurred to me as a Christian, as a member of a church that would affiliate with the theologically conservative end of the Reformed evangelical spectrum, that a lot of my academic knowledge could be useful for people in the church. Because I think, as most of you are aware, the Christian church, whether we're talking about evangelical Protestants or Catholics or possibly even mainline Protestants, the church today in the United States is riven with partisan arguments On the one hand, we have a sizable number of Christians who have associated their Christianity with conservative politics. That, of course, was the premise behind the Christian right that we'll be talking about today. But a growing number of Christians, and this has actually been true for some time, this isn't a new phenomenon in 2016 or the 2020 election or today in 2021, but we could say over the course of the last few decades, growing number of Christians have identified their faith with political stances on the left. And so we might ask, well, who's right? Or maybe even more practically, how do we work together in spite of these differences? There are a number of ways in which we could approach this subject. And indeed, I'm not the first, nor I'm sure will I be the last writer to talk about these issues. But what I thought I could do that perhaps relatively few people have done is to apply historical thinking and a close policy analysis to these issues of theological and cultural reflection. And I want to share a little bit of that study with you today. As Dan suggested, I'm going to take the first couple chapters of The Politics of the Cross and try to distill those down into about a 25-minute remaining, I guess, about a 25-minute talk that briefly surveys the history of the Democratic and Republican parties. And what we're going to ask today and try to answer will be questions like, how do the Republican and Democratic parties develop two different sets of moral values? Because I believe that both parties are engaged in moral inquiry, but from different premises. Now, I should qualify that and say that to some outsiders, and certainly if we looked from a global perspective, it may seem like the Democratic and Republican parties are really not that far apart when we consider the full spectrum of political choices that might be available to humans across the globe. But from our own perspective in the United States, I think it's fair to say that we're looking at two different sets of moral values. But both of those sets of moral values are grounded in Christian principles. And that's something that I want to show. And yet both sets are also distortions of Christianity. In fact, we might even go so far as to say that if someone fully subscribes to the Republican or Democratic platform, that they might be in danger of some form of Christian heresy by completely accepting one of those party platforms. And so finally, I want to ask this question: is there a Christian approach to our current partisan divide? If Christians are going to vote at all, and as I'll briefly note, I think there is a purpose in voting. I think it should be and can be a Christian act. But nevertheless, we need to be careful. We need to be careful to avoid partisanship, or at least the dangers of partisanship. And so the question is, what is the alternative? And so I'm going to assume a number of things or also try to provide evidence for them briefly. And so to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, where some of my answers are ultimately going to land, I will say that each of our two political parties does represent a moral perspective, but a different one. Neither one is consistently Christian. Both political parties are supported by large numbers of Christians today. So not only are they grounded historically in Christianity, but millions of Christians, tens of millions of Christians, can be found in either political party. And yet both parties can also be forms of Christian heresy. So the more partisan a Christian is, the more they are in danger of heresy. Now, what do I mean by partisanship? I don't necessarily mean simply straight ticket voting, that is party line voting. That could be a wise choice. That doesn't necessarily make one a partisan loyalist. The problem that I see is when Christians begin to equate a particular party platform or particular partisan identity with Christianity itself, and to view the other party as the enemy. And so what I'm arguing for is a charitable approach that is going to see both the Christian truth and the Christian heresy that might be present in the other party that we haven't chosen, as well as in our own party. And so I'm going to try to present a balanced account of the two parties as best as I can provide. I don't think that the two political parties are always morally equivalent, but it does mean that neither party can be identified with the kingdom of God, and yet both parties, I would argue, can be identified with some form of truth at some level. Now, just to quickly look at one alternative option that a number of Christians have advocated over the years, and some Christians still advocate, I want to talk briefly about the stance of political abstention, of a refusal to vote on conscientious grounds. Certainly, the Anabaptist tradition has been influenced by this line of thinking, but one can find elements of it in a number of other traditions. The early 20th century Pentecostals, for example, generally did not vote on religious grounds. And so, very briefly, I want to address this question: should Christians vote at all if politics can be so dangerous? And the answer that I quickly give after surveying the alternative in the politics of the cross is yes, I believe that we should, because I believe in a theology of loving our neighbor. And I believe in a theology in which every aspect of our lives belongs to Jesus. If Jesus is Lord over everything, then he's certainly Lord over our communities, over our political choices. And in the United States, we have a privilege that certainly the original Christians in the first century did not have, and that is to use the democratic process to somehow influence the outcome of policies and to somehow change the course of government. And there are numerous examples of ways in which one can love our neighbor by doing that. It starts at the local level of voting perhaps for a slight increase in property taxes in order to fund local schools, just to give one example. And that could be an act of loving our neighbor, especially if it's not self-interested. That is, if I don't have children of my own in a public school, but decide that, yes, schools will be good for the community, therefore I'll vote for those. That could be one example of loving our neighbor through politics. Of course, there might be some Christians, even in that election, that would make an alternative choice on religious grounds. And rather than go through all the complications of that choice, I'll just concede the point that even in a case like that, you can have people of political differences both advocating loving their neighbor. But the point is that in order to show love to our neighbor in those particular cases, we have to vote. And so I respect Christians that have chosen to abstain from the political process. In fact, when I find historical examples of that, sometimes I think maybe the people who made that choice retained a greater degree of God-centered focus in their lives, and I can applaud that. But nevertheless, non-voting is not the choice that I believe the Bible mandates in any way, nor do I think it's the best reflection of biblical theology as I've come to understand it, even though, of course, a vote is a unique privilege of a cultural moment. It's not something that all Christians throughout time, or even all Christians today in the world, necessarily can enjoy. But now let's get into the real meat of what we're going to be looking at today, which is the history of the Democratic and Republican parties, or a very quick survey of their Christian influence and Christian distortions. And so we'll talk first about the Democratic Party, then we'll talk about the Republican Party, and then very briefly I'll try to draw some conclusions about where we are today. The Democratic Party is a party that has historically been influenced by liberal Protestantism. It's been influenced by a variety of other religious traditions as well. African-American Protestantism and American Catholicism have influenced the Democratic Party to a large degree, but its dominant influence for the last 100+ years, maybe even approximately the last century, has been liberal Protestantism. And so I want to just talk a little bit about what that means. The Democratic Party began in the early 19th century as the party of what people would have called, as at the time, the common man. Today, of course, we understand that they meant the common white man. The Democratic Party in its early years made no secret of its racism, of its support for a states' rights position on slavery, or even a more strongly pro-slavery stance immediately before the Civil War. But one thing that has continued in the Democratic Party, despite all the changes, and certainly the Democratic Party's change on race has been substantial over the course of, the last few decades. But one thing that has remained constant is that the Democratic Party has portrayed itself, and I think genuinely believes itself to be, the party of the less fortunate, the party that is opposed to the moneyed interests, as they would see it. This began in the early 19th century with Andrew Jackson, and it continued well after the Civil War. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Democratic Party was primarily made up of working class people from the North, combined with a majority of white Southerners, the overwhelming number of whom were below average income in the United States. And so as a result, the Democratic Party always portrayed itself as the party against banking interests, the party in favor of common people. It was not initially a party of government expansion, but that changed in the 20th century as a result of the social gospel. In the late 19th century, a number of Protestant ministers, like the New York Baptist Walter Rauschenbusch, discovered a social gospel. And by social gospel, what I mean is a view of Jesus' message that applies it primarily to society, that says that a Christian must be engaged with helping others and improving not only individuals' lives, but the structure of society to make society a more just and equitable place. And this started with Rauschenbusch when he moved to an area of New York that today is actually a very nice area to live. It's near Times Square, but at the time was known as Hell's Kitchen. It was one of the most impoverished areas of the city. He could have chosen a different pastorate if he had wanted to, but he chose to minister to the poor, and he immediately began opening up food services to the poor, opening up a soup kitchen. But he also decided that a lot more was needed to improve the lives of people who were crowded into small tenement houses in New York, living in buildings that appeared to be fire hazards, or worse yet, living on the street, orphans sleeping over steam grates. What could the church do to solve these problems? Well, for Rauschenbusch and for many other advocates of the social gospel, that very quickly led into the question of what can the government do? How can a society provide greater regulation to avoid scenes like this, to solve the crisis of the cities? And it wasn't just Rauschenbusch, but a whole movement of Protestants at the time, liberal Protestants, ministers who were educated in some of the more progressive seminaries of the time. They came together and said that churches were, as Shaler Matthews put it, who was one of these liberal Protestants, churches were the most effective agencies of reform. And the first organization, the first national organization of Protestant churches across the denominational spectrum, called the Federal Council of Churches of Christ, published, as soon as it started in 1908, the Social Creed of the Churches, advocating an improved social structure that would include labor union rights, that would include the rights of workers to education, to an improved wage. And so throughout the 20th century, the leading journals of liberal Protestantism, especially the Christian Century, which was the leading journal of the movement, routinely commented on political questions, invariably from a position that assumed a more active state to improve the lives of the less fortunate. A cause that today we don't really think of as being a liberal cause was generally associated with the social gospel movement in the early 20th century, and that was temperance or prohibition, the idea that by eradicating alcohol from society, that America would be better off. And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest women's organization in the United States in the late 19th century, was very closely allied in many ways with the social gospel movement. Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the late 19th century, advocated voting rights for women, advocated other social gospel measures, including workers' rights. And so it's not too surprising that in the early 1930s, the Federal Council of Churches reiterated its call for a social creed, and many liberal Protestants endorsed Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Once the Democratic Party borrowed many liberal Protestant ideas, and became the agency of social uplift and social reform that liberal Protestants had been calling for, there was an increasingly strong relationship between liberal Protestant ministers who believed in the social gospel and the increasingly liberal Democratic Party. Catholics as well strongly supported FDR's New Deal, and throughout most of the 20th century, the majority of American Catholics, at times even the overwhelming majority, at times approaching 80% of American Catholics, voted Democratic. And they did so because the American Catholic Church was primarily a working class church, but it was also because Catholics had a deep theology of social welfare. This could be traced back to a papal encyclical of 1892 called Rerum Novarum, but it was then translated into the language of American politics with the National Catholic Welfare Council, which was an organization of American Catholic bishops. And from its founding in 1919, the National Catholic Welfare Council called for a living wage, that is, a wage that would be high enough for workers to support their entire family. They called for a social ethic based on the principle of human dignity, founded on the idea of the right to life and then the right to respect for all people. And so some of the people who were most active in that agenda also became very active in the New Deal. Father John Ryan, for example, a Catholic priest who had done a lot to push the American Catholic Church into endorsing the idea of a living wage, became a member of the Industrial Appeals Board of the National Recovery Administration. That is one of the hallmark New Deal agencies. The NRA, of course, in this context doesn't refer to what we most commonly think of as the NRA today. It's a completely separate acronym. After the Great Depression and World War II, Democrats who believed very much in the ethic of social betterment in the name of Christianity applied that to the global context with the Cold War. Certainly, President Harry Truman did that. And so the Cold War civil religion, which was bipartisan at the time, drew on the Democratic Party's belief in improving the world in the name of Christ or in the name of God. And so if you look at excerpts from President Harry Truman's inaugural address of 1949, he was drawing on liberal Protestant language. He was uniting the concept of social betterment at home with the idea of social betterment for the entire world. As he said, we believe that all men are created equal because they're created in the image of God. From this faith we will not be moved. Steadfast in our faith in the Almighty, we will advance toward a world where man's freedom is secure. And with God's help, the future of mankind will be assured in a world of justice, harmony, and peace. That was the center of liberal Protestantism in the mid-20th century. And the Democratic Party was very much drawing on that. You can see that in this campaign poster, which of course is designed to look like a comic book, but this campaign poster that the Truman campaign issued in 1948, where it's set in the context of the Cold War, it's set in the context of the United Nations, and President Truman says, "This is the hour to rededicate ourselves to the faith in mankind that makes us strong, to the faith in God that gives us confidence as we face the challenge of the years ahead." Now, this liberal Protestant or liberal democratic political message continued to evolve in the 1960s because of the civil rights movement and the influence of the African American church. Liberal Protestants had, since the 1930s, given some attention to racial equality, but it became the center of their political program in the early to mid 1960s as a result of the activism of Martin Luther King Jr., who sat on the editorial board of Christian Century, as well as other African American ministers in the movement. And as a result, nearly every liberal Protestant minister that went to seminary in the 1960s or shortly thereafter came to adopt a rights-conscious view of equality and liberalism. The campaign in Selma, Alabama, the Civil Rights March in Selma, Alabama, which drew 400 members of the clergy to that event, was a seminal moment for a lot of liberal Protestants because those who participated came back. They were changed by their encounter with the civil rights movement. They wrote about it. they brought back this rights-conscious ideology, which to this day is still, I think, central to liberal Protestantism. Shortly thereafter, in the late 1960s, a number of clergy in liberal Protestant and some Catholic churches in the United States decided to break with the government over the Vietnam War. And while earlier in the 20th century, in the 1950s, they had very much seen themselves allied with the government in the quest of the Cold War to bring freedom to people overseas in the name of faith and Christianity, they, by turning against the Vietnam War, adopted a very different stance toward the government. And indeed, that's the stance that still informs liberal Protestantism to this day. The demonstrations against the war in Iraq in the first decade of the 21st century during the George W. Bush administration were an example of this, the carryover very much of the legacy of the protests against the Vietnam War. And this quest for racial equality has expanded to include gender equality and LGBTQ issues as well. Liberal Protestants, in some cases, have been leaders in that. The United Church of Christ, for example, began campaigning for LGBTQ rights as early as the mid-1970s. Other liberal Protestant denominations followed at some point after that. So as far as liberal Protestants are concerned today, there's a close relationship between their ideals and the ideals of the Democratic Party. There's also a fairly strong relationship between the Democratic Party today and the Black church. No presidential candidate from the Democratic Party can get elected today without strong support from the Black church. And that was, of course, one of the main reasons why Joe Biden won the Democratic presidential nomination, because of his success in South Carolina and then in other states following that, because of strong support from African Americans that was channeled through the Black church. And so today, the religious left, as it's sometimes called, is a coalition of liberal white Protestants, some liberal Catholics, a number of African American Protestants, and a few Catholics who share beliefs in equality and human rights and concern for the less fortunate. And the Democratic Party has adopted most of those stances. Now, I should note that there are tensions between some Democratic Christians and the Democratic Party. So, for example, Hispanic Catholics who vote overwhelmingly Democratic tend to be at odds with the Democratic Party on its stance on abortion. According to one recent poll, 54% of Hispanic Catholics say that abortion should be illegal in most or all cases. And so there are tensions. And the Democratic Party is also, in general, a slightly less Christian party than the Republican Party, though even that is perhaps overstated at times by people on the right. If you look at the polling, you still see that Christians account for about 63% of Democratic Party voters. But half of those Democratic Party Christians are non-white. Among white Democrats, there's been an exodus from the church. And we can see that with the decline in membership numbers in America's mainline Protestant denominations, like the Episcopal Church, Methodist Church, PCUSA, and others who've all lost members in recent years. What has happened to those people? Well, to a large extent, I think we've seen what has happened to the Clintons as something that has happened quite commonly across the board. That is, Bill and Hillary Clinton were both very strongly churched. Their daughter Chelsea grew up with a Christian identity, married a Jew who is not a Christian. And I don't know exactly what her own stance on faith is and exactly how she's raising the next generation, but that example of someone who retains all the values of liberal Protestantism, but doesn't necessarily identify very strongly with the tradition, accounts, I think, for the secularization of white Democrats. 42% of white Democrats are non-Christians today. And yet, their values are very much that of liberal Protestants. So what we could say is that the politics of human rights, the politics of equality in the Democratic Party have strong Christian origins. From an Orthodox evangelical perspective, that is probably going to lead to some areas of tension with Orthodox Christian theology in some of the specific applications of those principles of human rights and equality. So what we can say is, as I said at the beginning, there's a Christian principle here. From the viewpoint of some Christians, there's also a distortion of that principle. Let's talk about the religious right in the Republican Party very briefly, and I haven't left myself a whole lot of time for that, so I'll try to go through this quickly. The Republican Party was founded by Northern Protestants as the party of Protestant morality. It was, of course, an anti-slavery party. It was the party, though, of responsible individual morality. The party against excessive drinking, for example, it tended to give strong support to prohibition in the early 20th century. And in the 1950s, it continued to be a party of civil religion, of maintaining morality in public life through the venue of an overt profession of faith. This was certainly what Dwight Eisenhower was doing as president in the 1950s, and it was what Billy Graham strongly endorsed. In the 1970s, a number of evangelical Protestants and some Catholics created a Christian right that allied itself with the Republican Party because they perceived a loss of religious influence in public life and perceived attacks on the American family associated with the sexual revolution and the feminist movement. And they linked all of those together. That is, they linked the Supreme Court's decisions on school prayer with abortion or second wave feminism, the Equal Rights Amendment, and the sexual revolution. All of these things they thought were part of a package that they identified as secular humanism. This, in their minds, became especially associated with the Supreme Court's decision on abortion in Roe v. Wade. And I've written at length on this. I don't really have time to go through all of that in 60 seconds or so that I have here. But I'll just say that the growing importance of Roe v. Wade to the Christian right in its thinking during the course of the 1980s, as they continued to reflect on this decision, galvanized a movement that saw the government as a threat to the family, to moral values, to Christianity, and in the case of abortion, even to human life itself. And so the moral majority quickly came to make opposition to abortion one of their central stances. But the Christian right was about more than just opposition to abortion. It was about protecting the families they sought and protecting the rights of parents and protecting the rights of individual churches against the encroachments of a liberal state. And because they phrased it in those terms, they were strongly attracted to the moderately libertarian anti-government stances, at least in terms of the social issues, when it came to President Ronald Reagan. Republicans and evangelicals have continued to be strongly allied. In fact, white evangelicals have become increasingly more likely to vote Republican over time. I should note that there are about 20% of white evangelicals who continue to vote Democratic or occasionally third party in presidential election after presidential election. And so there is a vibrant evangelical left, but it is much smaller than the evangelical right or the Christian right. The religious left, especially when it comes to evangelicals, tends to take issues that are of concern to liberal Protestants as well, protecting the rights of immigrants and minorities, for example. They tend to be somewhat at odds with the Democratic Party over abortion, though they often would like to reframe the abortion issue as an issue of poverty, an issue of economic opportunity, offering positive alternatives to abortion rather than focusing so heavily on making abortion illegal. But as I said, that minority stance among evangelicals tends to be dwarfed by this larger contingent of evangelicals who have voted Republican, partly to protect religious liberty as they would see it, I think out of fear that the Democratic Party is not interested in protecting religious liberty, partly in order to protect the Supreme Court when opposition to abortion has become so heavily concentrated around reversing Roe v. Wade. Of course, that is only going to be possible, if it's possible at all, through Republican presidents. And so for all of these reasons, and probably a number of others, white evangelicalism has retained and even strengthened its alliance with the Republican Party. There are a number of Christians who share some theology with evangelicals who are perhaps not in the same camp politically. Catholics tended to be ambivalent about the Republican Party at best for most of their history. For the first 75 years of the 20th century, Catholics were overwhelmingly Democratic, and even in recent years, they've tended to split their votes as they draw very heavily on a tradition of helping immigrants, a tradition of their own social teaching, and their own theological ambivalence about hawkish foreign policies, particularly nuclear weapons buildup in the 1980s. African-American Protestants have been overwhelmingly Democratic by margins about 90% or more. And of course, mainline Protestantism has been moving more steadily into the Democratic Party camp in every decade of my lifetime and even before. So to conclude, what I would say is that one can find sizable groups of Christians in either political party with different moral lenses, different applications of the Christian teaching, and with concerns about the distortions of Christian teaching in the other party. And what I would encourage you to do is to draw on both of these critiques and realize that there is an element of truth in all of these positions, but also, of course, an element of distortion in the way that both political parties have applied those. So is there a Christian way to vote? Well, as Dan Hummel said, I'm not going to tell you which box to check in the voting booth. That wouldn't be appropriate, and it's not really my purpose. What I would encourage you instead to do is to change your attitude, if you are a partisan Christian, to change your attitude about how you look at these issues, to realize that it's still appropriate to have strong convictions over a particular application of a Christian principle in the political realm, as long as we make an effort to understand the way that other Christians have approached that issue, perhaps from a different perspective. And doing so, I think, will allow us to approach it with more charity, more humility, and definitely more understanding across the political divide, whether it's in our churches, whether it's in our neighborhoods. And I think we'll be able to more effectively love our neighbors as a result. Thank you. Looking forward to the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for just the whirlwind tour of the history there. There's a lot more detail of those same stories in the first third of Politics of the Cross. I thought I could just start. I'm just going to ask a few questions here to give people a better sense of the book and the scope of it, and a little in the background of why you wrote it and what you're hoping people take away from it. And then we'll move on to audience questions. I thought to start off, I'd just ask you to sort of sketch the rest of the book. So these are the first couple chapters of the book. What do you do in the other 2/3 basically of the book, and how does it connect sort of this history of the two political parties?
Yes, so there's one chapter on abortion, one on marriage and sexuality, a third chapter on race, and a fourth chapter on poverty and economics. And what I try to do with these case studies is to look in detail at how each political party has approached those issues, and to argue that in most cases, the solution for Christians is perhaps somewhere outside of the conventional political box. To give you one quick example with abortion, we have, of course, as we know, a polarized polarized political system when it comes to abortion. Republicans are almost uniformly the party that would say that they're the party pro-life, and nearly every Democratic candidate running at any level is going to be pro-choice in support of reproductive rights, I guess, as it would be currently phrased. And so a Christian who believes that life begins at conception and who believes that life should be protected in the womb is perhaps inclined to say, well, I should vote Republican, therefore. But I argue in that chapter that the issue is a lot more complicated, because if our question is which policies are going to reduce the number of abortions in this country, which policies would really protect the greatest number of lives, born or unborn, then the answer might be different than we would give if we're just looking at that narrow question of which party says that it's pro-life. And so if I do that with abortion, I think I can do that with the other issues as well. And by the end of the book, I think a Christian will realize that we can't consistently support the philosophy of either political party, but we can find particular policies that perhaps will advance the causes that we care about, to love our neighbor, to promote justice, to protect human life, and to ultimately be a witness for Jesus in this world. So I think the first two chapters are really important because they explain how partisanship is really distorting our Christian vision, and that both political parties could lay claim to some Christian principles, though also Christian distortions. But then someone is likely to say after the end of that second chapter, well, both the Republican and Democratic parties are Christian heresies, distortions of Christian principles. How do I then make any choice? How do I sort through these particular policy issues? And that's what the rest of the book tries to do.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, and your example of abortion was spot on. You sort of go diagonally into these issues, if you could say it. That there's sort of a rhythm to the chapters where you end up at a place that is really, in our current context, not partisan. It's sort of drawing from values of one party and maybe policies of another party, you could say, in many cases. So, yeah, thanks for that setup. This is a book that isn't purely history, and for most of your previous books, they've been sort of traditional historical accounts. And so this one is really a mix of, there's definitely history, but also theological reflection and policy analysis. That's a sort of a change in the type of writing. What drew you to write that book and write it sort of right now?
I think conversations with Christians, whether at my own congregation or elsewhere, have given me reasons, I think, to write something like this. It occurred to me in so many conversations that I had with people about politics, especially people in the church, that there was a lot of missing information. And I thought that because of my training in political history, because of the research that I've done on abortion and on the Christian right, that I was able, I thought, to say something that would be useful. So parts of this book draw on God's own party, parts of the book draw on defenders of the unborn. But as you said, a lot of it draws on new data as well. And I realized that I enjoy policy analysis. Maybe I have not done a whole lot of that in previous writing. But I thought that especially for the church, the missing dimension in the conversation that I've generally found about political issues is this question of what will be the result of particular policies. So, for example, with Roe versus Wade, what would be the result of overturning Roe v. Wade in terms of practical policy? What would state abortion laws look like? What would be the result of those state abortion laws? That's an example of a policy question that I think is so often missing when it comes to Christian reflections on politics. And maybe that's okay that it's missing in certain contexts. That is, if we're talking about politics from the pulpit, or if we're talking about politics in a strictly theological context, it would probably be inappropriate to go too deeply into a particular policy analysis. But as a historian, and especially a historian of the American political system, it would be perfectly appropriate for me, I think, to go into that analysis. But as a Christian who shares a lot of the convictions with the people that I'm trying to write to in this book, with my intended audience, I can also then explain how I fit this analysis into a scriptural framework, how I think about Christian theology as I'm in the process of engaging in policy analysis.
Great, and that takes me to the next question, which is in your intro, you talk about the sort of theological framework that you're drawing on, and you mentioned the Reformed tradition and Catholic social teaching as sort of two big influences. So if you could just give a sketch of sort of why you named those and what you find so helpful with those frameworks.
Sure. Well, so certainly whenever we're talking about frameworks that are that broad, there are always numerous nuances that are going to get lost in a quick summary. But to give an attempt at the quick summary, I would say that Reformed theology tends to draw very deeply on Augustinian frameworks, and so it's going to start with the principle of a good creation and God's reign over the earth, with people being created as image bearers. But then, of course, the fall and the idea that original sin affects our very core, every aspect of our being. It affects social structures as well as individuals, and therefore the deliverance is ultimately going to have to come from God. It's not going to come through human effort of society just getting better and better through better moral visions or greater sensitivity to particular human rights or something of that nature. From Catholic social theology, I get a very strong affirmation of the Imago Dei in every person, our status as image bearers, and a theology of justice that's based on reciprocal obligations as a result of that command that God gave to not only care for creation, but specifically to be our brother's keeper, so to speak, to care for other image bearers. And so I think that, especially in terms of application in the American context, the Catholic Church got it right so often. Now, as I said briefly, I'm not a Catholic, but I have borrowed a lot from Catholic theology in my own application of theological principles, because I think so often, actually, if you look at the Christian traditions that have come closest to balancing some of the tensions that I think exist in our political system, Catholic social theology so often gives us the tools to do that.
Great, thank you. And yeah, it just strikes me that there's also, and not just those two traditions, but others as well, that there's a lot of overlap in sort of in the biblical theology underlying it, and in even if they are emphasized differently in different traditions, there is a lot of overlap. So you could imagine also bringing in other traditions, maybe a more holiness tradition as well, and being able to use some of those tools as well to get to very similar ways of talking about these things. Great. Well, I just have a couple more questions, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. One through line in the book is weighing the act of voting against other Christian obligations or other ways Christians are called to engage with their communities. And you mentioned this a little when you were talking about those Christians who decide not to vote for whatever reason. But for you, what does it mean to vote, and how should Christians think about the act of voting in relation to other obligations to act out the gospel in their lives?
Yeah. So at its most basic level, voting is expressing an opinion about how our society should be organized and how we should live together in a social community. So I think as Christians, we should have an opinion about that. I think our Christian theology are the things that we know about God and God's relationship to human beings should affect our preferences on how we live together in community. So I think voting is, if it's done through a Christian framework, it's an act of love for our neighbor. It's saying, I want to create a community that, to the best degree that I understand it, is going to be a just community. It's going to be a community that would advance creation principles that would lead to the well-being of every person in that society. And so that's how I would make the case for Christian voting, and how I should say we should vote. We should not vote out of self-interest, contrary to what we often hear in the world, but we should vote with our neighbor in mind, and with the gospel witness in mind. Now, having made the case for voting, I also want to, as your question suggests, make the case for not overemphasizing voting. I think there's a real danger, especially among social progressives today, to make politics the primary act of engagement with our neighbor, or the primary way in which we try to show love toward others. And it certainly doesn't replace in any way the need for us to really engage with people who are poor, with people who are marginalized, with people who are perhaps different than we are. It doesn't replace the obligation to give very generously, to live a life of generosity. And so a Christian has many obligations, and a Christian, I think, the more that we practice those obligations, the more we'll see the limits of politics. There are so many things that a family can do more effectively than the government. There are so many things that a church can do more effectively than the government. And so we should perhaps recognize humbly the limitations of politics, the limitations of voting. At the same time, though, if we're really active with all these other obligations, whatever attitude we bring into the polling booth is going to be reflective of that spirit of generosity. We're going to say, not how can I protect myself? How can I keep the government from taking away what's mine? But we're instead going to say, how can I be the most Christ-like, generous, self-giving person that I can in making my voting decision?
Great, thank you. You sort of summarized a lot of your vision of what that alternative to partisanship is right there in what you were saying, and thanks for that. Last question before we go to audience Q&A. The book, and this is sort of about how you educate yourself on these issues, and maybe how people watching can think about this too. You end the book with a robust further reading list that includes so many books that many of us, it would take over multiple years probably to get through them all. At which point there's a whole new crop of books that have come out since we started that task. I think that's a great list, and there are definitely really good resources on there. But that prompts a question about what role sort of educating yourself is as part of this alternative to partisanship. And so I wonder, first, how do you educate yourself? How do you stay informed? And how do you think about consuming either news or longer form books and other things on issues? And then do you have any recommendations for people watching who maybe don't have as much time or as much energy, but still want to be informed, just sort of getting a window on what you're doing?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say is it's important to try to find sources that are based on real observations by reputable people who have done their research. And by that I mean, it's a disturbing trend in American political commentary over the last 2 decades that many Americans' primary source of news now is a talk show or a Facebook post or some form of social media that is not generated by someone who engaged in the effort to find real information. So we might disagree with the assumptions of a reporter, for example. And I think certainly a New York Times story, or New York Times news article, for example, can often be critiqued in terms of perspective and how the reporter's perspective might have influenced the questions that were not asked, or the what or even the things that were asked and the story that resulted. But nevertheless, I would say that regardless of whether you agree with the reporter's presuppositions, that story is almost always going to be a considerably more reliable source of news than an opinion piece, than a commentary, a sort of a repost on Facebook or something of that nature that's not based on real information. So it's not that we should never read commentary, that we should never look at opinion. In fact, I think it's really valuable to do that, but we need to make sure that we're also going to the source, that we're trying to get original, reputable information. But then beyond that, I think it is useful to read a number of thoughtful people, maybe from varying perspectives, and I try to do that. I try to look at people that I would view as thoughtful conservatives, like Ross Douthat, for example, and then also look at Christian opinion and something like Christianity Today magazine, but also look at opinions on the left, some of which come from other Christian sources, very liberal Christian sources like Christian Century, as well as secular sources, secular commentators that, again, I view as people who are thoughtful, who are going to not simply echo a partisan line. I do think that the combination, whatever we decide to look at, I hope for each person would be a combination of reputable news sources that are not simply opinion, thoughtful opinion from a variety of perspectives that is informed by books that maybe we don't have time to read. So there are thoughtful commentators like Ross Douthat, for example, who would read widely in ways that I have not necessarily read, and maybe he can bring attention to certain ideas even if I disagree with some of his conclusions. And then beyond that, to try to read some Christian sources, especially from people who share our own theological convictions, but not simply Christian sources that are echoing a partisan line, but Christian sources that are trying to stand outside of the partisan tradition. And I think, for example, that some of, at a popular level, some of Tim Keller's books on generous justice, for example, or other issues can be a way of getting this nonpartisan Christian perspective on issues of social import. But beyond that, of course, there are more academic texts that, if people have time, they could delve into to look at how Christians have wrestled with some of these political questions over the years and continue to wrestle with them today. None of us, of course, can read all of what we want to read. There's so much that I would like to read about some of these issues that I have not. I try to make wise use of my time to be as informed as I can, but I would be the first to admit there's a lot that I'd like to explore further that I haven't had the chance to do yet.
Great, thank you. I would just add maybe two really practical things that I think about. One is regular meeting book groups are always a fun way to sort of work through. It's a long game at that point. You're trying to work through stuff over years or something, but having some type of accountability with others. And then I've always found that if you have places that you like reading that have book review sections that are well done, you can often, you don't want to cheat and just read the book review, but you can often use the book reviews to decide what books are actually worth investing the longer amount of time in. And again, those are things that are already sort of luxuries for some people, reading book reviews and other stuff. But that's often a way to at least get a lay of the land of what's out there, and then being able to discern what's actually something you want to invest multiple hours in to read. Okay, great. Well, we're going to jump to Q&A. I want to start off actually with a question from the chat that sort of closes the loop on on your talk, Dan. And this is from Nicole, and she says, it seemed you summarized the Christian principle that most impacted the Democratic Party, caring for and loving your neighbor. How would you summarize the principle most impacting the right or the Republican Party in terms of Christian moral principles?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I did feel bad, I guess, that I sort of spent too much time on the Democratic Party and rushed through the Republican Party as a result. So, yeah, to return to the Republican Party, I think that there's a very strong belief in individual moral responsibility. That was true in 1860, and of course, that's true in 2021. That principle is a true biblical principle. I think that there's a principle that's often lost among liberal Protestants that revolves around individual sin. That I do believe the Bible teaches that we are all individually accountable to God. So I believe in structural sin. I believe the Bible teaches that. The Bible teaches a structure of the fall that affected all of creation. But sin is also individual, and the call to holiness is individual. The Republican Party is also influenced, I think, by what Catholics would call the principle of subsidiarity, which I also believe is Christian and biblical, which is the idea that we do not take every social problem to the government to solve, that God created other structures, other social structures as primary. So first the family and then the church, and that the family and the church have responsibilities that the government should not take away. That the government can supplement, I believe, but not replace. And so that principle, which is maybe not directly spelled out in any Bible verse, but I think it's indirectly taught in commands like in 1 Timothy 5 to for any individual believer to care for their own needy members of their family, and then only bring it to the church if they're unable to care for those needy members themselves. And if that's true of the church, then even more so, one could argue by extrapolation, if it's true of a secular state, that this would be a place of last resort rather than first resort. So that would be another principle that I think informs conservatism that the Republican Party has adopted. There's a principle of Christian nationalism, which I view as unbiblical, and we may get into that, but there are Bible verses that Christian nationalists will cite, I think incorrectly, but Second Chronicles chapter 7, I believe is verse 14, is a popular verse that's excerpted from a prayer that King Solomon made at the dedication to the temple, or a promise that God made at that point. And it says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and seek my face, then I will be their God and will heal their land. And they take that promise of God made to ancient Israel and apply it to any country that is seeking God. And so I think one of the things that strongly motivated the Christian right was the belief that the United States would be under judgment if it did not collectively repent, that the nation itself would stand or fall based on its relationship with God that was in some way covenantal. And they believed that politics was a way to reclaim that. And so that principle has guided Christian nationalism, which has also informed the Republican Party. I don't think that's traditionally been the dominant influence in the Republican Party. The Republican Party has not primarily been a Christian nationalist party, but it has definitely had elements of Christian nationalism within it for a number of decades. So those are examples. I think traditionally the Republican Party has been the party of mainline Protestantism, a more conservative form of liberal Protestantism that is somewhat theologically liberal, but practically conservative because it was based on an individual morality. I call it in the book the politics of Protestant moralism. And then more recently, in the last 40 years or so, the Republican Party has increasingly become evangelical, more so than mainline Protestant. And the particular version of evangelicalism that it's emphasized has embraced this individuality, this individualism of the Protestant moralism, but has grafted onto that particular evangelical concerns regarding sexuality and abortion, and also strong emphasis on preserving the family. And those, by the way, I would say are legitimate Christian principles. That is, the overwhelming majority of Christians over the centuries have seen value in fetal life, and have also seen the importance of marriage and family that has been applied in very different ways. And this could be a long conversation as to exactly which groups of Christians have believed which things. But these principles, I believe, are in some way Christian, are in some way biblical, though their particular applications at times, I think, have been distorted through a selective lens that tends not to give enough emphasis, I believe, to the principle of original sin. And it's devolved, instead of necessarily being gospel-centered, it's often middle-class moralistic.
Well, let's lean into, you mentioned Christian nationalism. There were a number of pre-submitted questions around that topic from Stephen and Deb and Sue, and they all had different aspects to it. But I wondered if you wanted to maybe talk about, you talked about some of the scriptural, or at least one text that many Christian nationalists use to sort of support their view. Maybe if we could back up for a second and define it a little more, and then sort of how would you respond to that argument? And one thing I just want to note, and then you can jump off on this historical comment as well, is if you were listening to Dan's talk, it might strike you too that that covenantal language about God and America, I mean, that also rings or echoes through things like Truman's speech that you cited, where there's this very clear sense by Truman that God is on the side of sort of American values as well. So it's an interesting, that's not to sort of minimize the current situation at all, but it's to say that over time, different parts of American Christianity have embraced a type of nationalism that's really elevated or made America exceptional in some way in their relationship to God. But anyway, that's just an observation. Dan, how would you sort of respond to Christian nationalism, and maybe define it here first?
Sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of recent writing on Christian nationalism, and I have read some of that recent scholarship. I haven't waded through all of it, but I think there's enough nuance and debate out there that someone is likely to define Christian nationalism differently than I do, because it can mean different things. But let me, I guess, just give you the way that I would define it, and we'll go with that definition for the purposes of this analysis. Christian nationalism is equating the state with a particular relationship with God. That is, there's a belief that God has a covenant nation in the United States. And not all Christian, there are people who are influenced by Christian nationalism that wouldn't necessarily go that far and say that God has this covenantal relationship with the United States. But in general, I would say the forms of Christian nationalism that we're probably most familiar with would say that that America is historically and should continue to be a nation whose primary religion is Christianity, and that affirms that religion in a public space, that it is appropriate and necessary for presidents, for example, to invoke God in their speeches, and to have references to God at civic events, and to have prayer in public schools, and to put Christian imagery in public spaces, because that's part of what America is and should be. And there's, on the part of many Christian nationalists, there's a fear that if the United States does not do that it would decline as a nation, and maybe even, in the view of Jerry Falwell and quite a few other Christian right activists, experience the judgment of God, that God would judge the United States for not fulfilling its Christian commitment. Some of these people have also traditionally seen American exceptionalism as mission-oriented. That is, that God has a unique purpose for the United States and the world, that maybe from an evangelical standpoint, it's to spread the gospel to the rest of the world. That's what Jerry Falwell believed, to send out missionaries throughout the world, to be an outpost of Christian evangelism. Or maybe from the standpoint of Harry Truman, it's this to preserve freedom in the world, to stand up against communism. But God has unique plans for the United States, just as he has unique plans for individuals. That would be part of Christian nationalism. So is this biblical? Well, it's certainly deeply American. One can find elements of that going all the way back to the Puritans, long before there was a United States, but certainly the idea of some form of exceptional community, some form of outpost for greater evangelism, some form of community that's in covenant relationship with God that is on American shores, goes back to the Puritans in Massachusetts. And then we can find strong Christian nationalist themes in every era of American history, and in a vague watered down form, even in American civil religion. But from a biblical standpoint, there are a number of questions that could be raised, not least of which is the fact that if Christianity didn't start with the United States, and the United States is not it is not necessarily a something that is the end all and be all of Christianity, the teleological goal of Christianity, then it calls into question some of the framework for Christian nationalism, perhaps. That the more global we are in our thinking about people's relationship to God through Jesus in terms of the global Christian community, the less room we might have for Christian nationalism. But I would say that in answer to this question of the biblical passages that people use, generally speaking, Christian nationalists, when they do cite the Bible, will probably apply statements that were made to covenant Israel and see those as applying in the same or similar way to the United States. And that can take many different forms. Often it takes the form of a promise. Sometimes it takes the form of a warning. Sometimes it's a bit of both. That verse from 2 Chronicles 7, I think, incorporates both the promise and to a certain degree the implied warning. Those who are opposed to Christian nationalism, I think, would emphasize the passages, especially from the New Testament, that emphasize the universality of the gospel and the universality of creation, that God created all of the nations under heaven and appointed their boundaries, from Acts 17. Acts 17 verse 28, I think, is that verse. There are other verses as well that strongly emphasize the church or the individual Christian, that don't really emphasize the nation. In fact, if you look at the New Testament in particular, that's not written to a covenant nation of Israel, but is written primarily to a Christian community, it's really hard to fit a lot of the verses, say verses on the Sermon on the Mount, which very much address individual behavior, and try to fit those within a Christian nationalist framework. And so what a lot of Christians would say who are opposed to Christian nationalism is that Christian nationalism can be a form of idolatry, of making the state into something that God never intended it to be, of making your nation, your imagined nation, into something that God never intended it to be. And that we need to instead emphasize the idea of that's in a book like First Peter, for example, of Christians as sojourners, as aliens in this world, rather than as uniquely identified with a particular nation that is their conduit to Jesus.
And moving on to a question that's sort of on the other end. This is from Fred. This is a pre-submitted question. He asks to explain how the church should respond to things like critical race theory and intersectionality. So if there are definitely a segment of Christians who are very concerned about the rise of Christian nationalism and what that's doing to the witness of the church, there's another segment of Christians who are very concerned about critical race theory and other things. How would you respond to those issues?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll just make a quick observation that's, I think, worth noting, which is that critical race theory as a slogan, as a phrase, is quickly becoming what secular humanism was as a phrase in the early 1980s. That is, it's not a term that people who allegedly believe in it tend to use very often. Critical race theory did have an academic origin, did have an academic context, but it was a fairly limited academic context. And I think the people that have popularized the use of that are the people who are strong critics of critical race theory. And critical race theory can mean a number of different things to different people. And in some ways, I'm not sure it's the most useful term, but to use it in the way that the critics of critical race theory would, which I think is the fairest way to approach the question, to say, okay, what is being critiqued here? I think from that perspective, critical race theory is the attempt to highlight racial injustices that have occurred in the past or in the present, and to view American society through the lens of these racial groups. That is, to emphasize the differences of the experiences between blacks and whites in the United States, for instance. And so critics of critical race theory among conservative Christians tend to view critical race theory as highly divisive in the American nation and in the church, and also to be fundamentally unfair. That is, they believe that it creates an imagined white guilt that is undeserved for the current individuals. They would acknowledge, of course, that there have been injustices in the past and maybe even in the present, but they would say that as a race, as a group of people, whites are not collectively responsible for those injustices individual people were. And they see the scriptural path toward unity, toward Christian unity, as de-emphasizing race rather than continuing to re-emphasize it. They tend to have a colorblind view of society. That is, they would like to see racial differences minimized, not accentuated. So I think the question that needs to be asked as we're approaching that is, one question would be, are those presuppositions valid theologically and culturally? And I think that while critics of critical race theory are correct in saying that our primary identity needs to be in Christ, in the church, that is, among believers, our identity ultimately comes from Christ. It doesn't come from our race, and that we need to avoid certainly overreacting to any revelation of racial injustice. That is, we don't want to say that whites have an original sin that blacks don't have. For example, that our original sin is racism, and this is that whites are guilty of that by virtue of being white, to use some caricatures, maybe some overstatements. But beyond that, what I would say is, so while there are some valid concerns, some truths, perhaps, I think when people talk about critical race theory in a critical context, they're often misunderstanding some of their imagined opponents. And I think it would be worthwhile for a number of Christians to read books like Esau McCaulley's Reading While Black, or Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise. I would encourage white Christians to read those books. Those books are written by African American Christians who I think are thoughtful. You may not agree with everything they say, but I think it will prompt your thinking to examine how pervasive racist structures are in American society. And so I think when we start to realize that, it gives us a different starting point than proponents of colorblind racism often have. and we might realize that the process of addressing these injustices will involve some deeper change than maybe we've been prepared to accept. And so, in my view, the people that I have read and talked to personally who have been strongly opposed to critical race theory have been insufficiently cognizant of the concerns that are expressed in books like The Color Compromise or Reading While Black. And so if your only knowledge of so-called critical race theory is coming from excerpts from, say, secular people like Eerdmans, who are maybe easy to caricature, I would really encourage you to spend some time reading thoughtful works of Black Christians who have pointed out continued structural racism in American society and in the church, but have also, I think, offered some scriptural reflections on that are worth considering. But yes, I mean, we definitely don't want to be too, we want to be critical of anything that we adopt from our secular society, but we also need to recognize that sometimes people have suggested that critical race theory is something that's coming only from the secular left, and there are actually some very thoughtful Christians, Black Christians, who might not share all the assumptions of their secular counterparts, but really have something worthwhile to say to us.
Thanks, Dan. A very complicated topic, and one right now particularly freighted with a lot of concern on many sides. I should just mention that both Jamar Tisby and Issa Macaulay have been past speakers, or at least we've co-sponsored things with them in the past year. And I'll also throw in the name Vincent Baycoat, who's a theologian at Wheaton College, who's also talked about these things. Well, thank you. We're going to have two more questions. One of them is a history question, which maybe will make you feel a little more at home, though it's a history question that goes pretty far back. Terry asks, is there evidence that the church thought about politics and government in the first 3 centuries? And I think what he's trying to get at with that question is sort of how should we think about the different contexts that we're in, that you really laid out in your presentation about American Christians and their relationship to government and democratic processes versus the early church, which had a much different context. How would you think about filtering as a Christian today that situation in the early church?
Yeah, yes, early Christians did think about politics, but not necessarily in the way that, say, Augustine thought about politics, because they lived at different moments. So in the New Testament, of course, book of Romans, the book of First Peter, and a number of other New Testament books. In fact, the closer we look, we find political statements shot throughout the entire New Testament, the Gospels, book of Acts, etc. So all of these books say something about our relationship to the government. After the New Testament, early Christians continued this line of reasoning. Justin Martyr, for example, in some of his apologies, spoke at length about what Christians could contribute to the Roman Empire as good citizens praying for the emperor. And he did so because he was trying to argue that the state should not execute Christians, that they were good citizens, people that the Roman Empire should want to have around. However, the early Christian thinking about politics tended not to be the sort of thing that we today identify as political theology. That is, so often our political theology today, and really the political theology of Augustine onward, tended to be focused on this question of what makes a well-run state, or what makes a good ruler. And that, of course, is something that the earliest Christians did not really have the luxury of being able to talk about, simply because, or in a meaningful way, simply because they were not privy to the halls of power. Today in the United States, of course, we live in a situation that's quite different from those first few centuries of Christianity, and as well as different from medieval Christendom and the Christendom even of the early modern era. We live in a society in which we do have an influence on government, but we also live in a very pluralistic society, and an increasingly pluralistic society in which not everyone shares our assumptions. And so that I think creates scenarios that are very different than what, say, a medieval Christian political thinker would have been familiar with, or what someone from antiquity, from the earliest centuries of Christianity before Constantine, would have been familiar with as well. And I think we can draw on those principles. Certainly, we should draw on the scriptural principles at a minimum, but then obviously apply them to our own context with an awareness that our own situation may be very different.
Thanks, Dan. Last question, and we're right at 1:30 here. This is from Justin, and I'm modifying it a bit, but can you think of, or can you just share one example of a person or a community that's living out the sort of nonpartisan politics of the cross that you're promoting? Some real world example that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, I think there are probably many examples, but one that I'll highlight will be the Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City that was associated with its founding pastor, Tim Keller. Tim Keller, I think, has been a remarkable example of someone who is deeply engaged with social justice questions in his community and in his church, but at the same time has tried very hard to avoid partisanship. As he's frequently said, at any given service, you're likely to see a conservative Republican sitting next to a progressive Democrat without either one of them necessarily knowing who the other person has voted for. And so that's an example of a church that talks about social justice, talks about engagement, tries very hard to critique both parties, to encourage partisan devotees of both parties to continue to stick around, to not be alienated by the message, which is gospel-centered rather than partisan. But at the same time, it also gives space to people to, in various small group forums, to share their ideas. So shortly before the most recent presidential election, I think they invited strong Democrats and strong Republicans to give talks to small groups affiliated with the church, applying Christianity to their voting choices, basically explaining why they voted the way they did as Christians, just to provide a learning experience to inspire dialogue. So I think that model may not work everywhere, but I think it's not a bad model. It's a model that I would actually aspire to. I think I appreciate several things. First of all, I appreciate the belief that the gospel is not simply political. It's about far more than politics. The idea that the gospel message transcends and critiques politics, but also the message that Christians need to be engaged in political actions, and that how we make those political choices while engaging in that kingdom work of working for justice, to love our neighbors, may differ, and that's okay. We can talk with each other about our differences as long as we do so lovingly. And so for a church to create the space for that within limits, I think is also a helpful model. So that's a model that I would look to if someone were asking the question, what might this look like today in the United States, in an urban area, in the 2020s?
Great. On that positive note, thank you, Dan, for your time, and thank you for the book. I encourage everyone to consider purchasing it. There's a link in the chat for a slightly discounted copy of the book. Thank you to everyone who took that poll, for one thing. I know it's not always fun to click on conservative, moderate, or liberal to self-identify on. But thank you for doing that. And thank you also for all the questions that came in. We only got to a fraction of them. But it was very fun for me to look through them all. And so thank you for your attention there. If you are interested in more programming at Upper House, or in looking at some of our past events that we've recorded, and this one will also be online right after this on our YouTube channel, you can go to upperhouse.org and find links there. And with that, thank you for joining, and have a good day, and go in peace.